A lot of people have been asking me to make a character build, tier list and team recommendations guide for Snowbreak Containment Zone, and I've been working on this for about a week, and it's finally done. Let's start with a quick overview of everything that is there in this guide, then we'll go over all the characters and their builds and why they're placed in the tiers that they're placed in the tier list. Alright? So firstly, we've got a section for the starters guides. This is for people who are just starting the game. So right now I only have one video about the reroll guide and the best pick for the free selector. Then we have the tier list. Then we have all the character builds. You can see all of this in the outline. Then we have a bunch of mechanics explained along with some exposition on hidden mechanics. A lot of this is in my videos, but also I'll add more stuff over here. And we have the banner schedule, and then we've got the community guides and other resources. So go ahead and look through these. These are all great. And then at the end I have my socials and a link to my Ko-Fi for tipping. Okay, let's go back to the guide introduction. First things first, this guide is meant to be for reference only. It's not a Bible or a definitive guide because a lot of the mechanics have yet to be unraveled, and a lot of testing is basically required to find out what the optimal builds and teams are. The translation is also not accurate for a lot of the descriptions, so we don't know if things work the way they've been described in-game. We've been figuring out a lot of hidden mechanics and figuring out that a lot of the descriptions for mechanics are just plain wrong. So use these ideas for character builds and team recommendations as a way to try out new teams and playstyles, rather than as a manual for how the game should be played. Now, Snowbreak is a highly skill-based game, so some builds might work better for your playstyle than others. There will also be times where it might be worth tweaking your builds for specific endgame stages, so please keep that in mind. Team building is also very dependent on your roster, and the recommendations listed in this guide are only suggestions for experimentation as opposed to optimal team recommendations from extensive testing. I've also mentioned 3 logistic sets, Navigator, Mizuho and Usha, which are only available in the Underground Purge shop for the currency that you gain from doing Underground Purge. If you want to buy a 4-star weapon, it's available in the shop for 300k silver bucks, but it refreshes daily, so I would recommend keeping 300k available so you can purchase it when it's in the shop. Alright, it's always in the first page of the shop, but also keep in mind that compatible 3-star weapons, max modified to tier 5, with dupes will often be more effective than an incompatible 4-star weapon. So if you're gonna buy a 4-star weapon, it has to actually be good for your builds. Alright, so let's start with the tier list and character builds, right? The first character we're going to talk about is Acacia Kaguya. She is tier SSS. She has one of the best AoE clears in the game with her standard skill, which also does a lot of frost damage and freezes if you have the second cluster unlocked in your neuronics. And her ultimate and support skills can pull enemies, so she has incredible utility, especially for stages with tanky mobs or multiple elite enemies. She's also a very good support in general with her 5-star weapon Pine Aurora, because it buffs the damage taken by enemies by 15% when you use her support skill. A lot of her strength is actually locked behind neuronics, so unlocking her neuronics is actually the highest priority for Acacia Kaguya. Okay, so the first build we're going to go over is her frost damage skill DPS build, which is all about spamming her standard skill to do a lot of frost damage, mostly AoE. And so firstly, we'll look at the weapons, right? So Pine Aurora is the best weapon for this because you'll be buffing a lot of frost damage and it's a frost weapon. So it is also a 5-star weapon, so it has the highest stats as well. It's going to be the best one for her. Then you have the second alternative, which is Rotten Orange, which is only good if you hit weak spots consistently. So you have to be critting all the time, hitting all the weak spots. Only then it's better than max modified Muddy Snow. And you're going to see this trend a lot where 3-star weapons are actually better than 4-star weapons unless you are using the 4-star weapons optimally, right? The best logistics set for this build is TB's because all of her skills hit the enemies a lot of times, so it's very easy to get the 20 stacks that you need for the plus 40% attack buff. Even if it's for 5 seconds, it actually buffs you for the duration of those skills. So it's really, really good. Then the substats you would want is Skill Haste and S Energy. The way you read this is that the first two are basically the substats that you want while farming the logistics, right? It's the random substat that you get when you actually get the logistics for the first time. And the third substat is the talent you unlock when you level them up to 15. So that is a different pool of talents that you get, a different pool of substats. And in that pool of substats, cross damage is the main substat that you would want to reroll for using a revision application. And the first two are Skill Haste and S Energy Recovery Bonus. What this will basically allow you to do is spam her standard skill because it will reduce the cooldown on her standard skill and also increase the energy regen so that you can have more and more energy to spam it continuously. And these numbers that you see right next to them is the max amount you can get on any logistics set for these specific talents. Then we have the Theotropic Clusters, which is the neuronics for the build. And these numbers are basically the numbers of the cluster nodes in neuronics. Like all of those clusters have their own number. And so these are written in priority. So your first priority for this build is going to be your standard skill neuronics. So you want the 3 charges first, and you want the freeze. Then you want to unlock the ultimate because you're going to be using her as an active operator most of the time. So you unlock her ultimate neuronics, then you unlock her standard neuronics. Most of the time, for most of these builds, the first 4 neuronics are what matter the most. The later ones, it's not a big deal because most of the time it doesn't relate to the build a lot. Her second build is the Frost Support build, where you basically reduce the resistance of the target to frost damage to buff your main frost DPS. And the weapons I recommend are Fine Aurora if you have M2, which is a second manifestation. Without M2, Prismatic Igniter, the 4-star weapon, is actually better on her. Then we also have II Captain if you don't have the other two, and then the Muddy Snow, max modification. The recommended logistics set for this build is Twilight because it reduces the resistance to frost damage of the target. And the recommended substats are Skill Haste and Attack. And for neuronics, you would go for the support neuronics first. Alright, now let's move on to manifestations and talk about her manifestations in depth. So M2 is pretty much the only big change for the support build because it increases her resistance shred on the support skill, which makes her invaluable for team building, especially if you have Fine Aurora, which buffs the damage taken by the enemy by 15% on top of that. And aside from that, actually her manifestations don't really have a big impact, so you don't have to prioritize farming her shards whatsoever. You can just farm other characters' shards instead. And for team recommendations, the first team I would recommend is the Frost team, with Kaguya is the main DPS. So you have a basic team of a main DPS, sub DPS, and a healer, where Kaguya is the main DPS, Lyfe or Mauxir could be the sub DPS, and Meow is the healer. You would build Twilight on the sub DPS to reduce frost resistance, and Moira on Meow to increase healing. Then the second team would be the classic Trinity DPS, which in most shooter games you have an AoE DPS weapon, a short-range DPS weapon, and a long-range DPS weapon to keep things balanced for what you need in each stage. And if you have this team of Kaguya, Coronet, and Winter Solstice, then you can clear pretty much any content in the game that you throw them at, as long as you know how to skillfully dodge enemy attack. And there's also a neat combo if you have Marian Swift in the team for AoE clear against tanky enemies with shield, where you can pull them with Kaguya's support skill and then use Marian Swift's ultimate on them when they're gathered in one place because it pierces through all the enemies. Alright, now let's move on to Fenny Coronet, who is also SSS tier because she is the best shotgun character in the game with lots of utility and an incredibly good support skill. Actually, pretty much everything about her kit is really useful. She can stagger and paralyze multiple enemies with her skills and buff the whole team's rate of fire. She also just does a lot of damage with the increased rate of fire and damage buffs from her standard skill. She's also a shotgun user, so she doesn't really face a lot of the issues from ricochet, and she's great against armored enemies. Makes her pretty much good in almost all stages against almost all enemies, except some very long range enemies, but even then you can ADS and hit them. So she's definitely SSS tier. Alright, let's move on to her first build. Her first build is the ADS Electric DPS build, which is based around one of the best logistic sets, Amano Iwato, where you have to hit critical hits to increase your ADS ballistic damage by 10% with 5 stacks max. So that's 50% ADS ballistic damage that you're getting. But what you have to do is hit weak spots, because weak spots are counted as crit hits at all times. So all you have to do in your playstyle is ADS on weak spots to maximize your shotgun DPS. And the effect also wears off when the operative leaves the field, but you don't have to worry about that much on a shotgun because you can get it very quickly by just aiming for the weak spot in one shot. And when 5 bullets hit, she has the max buff already. And of course you have a bunch of weapons that I've recommended. I'm not going to go over all of them for every single build, but these are basically the good ones. And for substats, you have crit damage, amplifier, attack, and electrical damage. For this build, you don't have crit rate because she already has a lot of crit rate from her Deus alignment, and if you're hitting weak spots for this build, then the crit rate doesn't even matter. And for the neuronics, you're going for the 5th, 1st, 2nd, basically this is the priority. So I'm not going to talk about the neuronics for every build because then the video will become too long. So just look into it later, right? Second build we have is the Hipfire Electric DPS. So not everyone actually enjoys the ADS shotgun playstyle, right? Even if it does more damage, that's not fun. And it might not be practical in certain stages as well, where the enemies are super aggressive or moving super fast. So Hipfire Electric DPS is all about spamming your standard skill and then using hipfire shotgun shots with that increased rate of fire. And the crit rate from the Deus alignment that I mentioned before means that you're going to do almost as much DPS as the ADS build at very high investment. And you're going to go for the Dharma Squad logistic set, because after using your standard skill, you're gonna hipfire. So that buffs your hipfire ballistic damage by 46% for 5 seconds. And you're going to go for attack and crit damage amplifier on this one as well. Pretty much the same stats and the same neuronic. There's a difference in playstyle and you pick which logistics set you want to go for based on your playstyle, right? Now let's talk about the manifestations. He actually gets better with every single manifestation in a pretty big way. And I do recommend farming her shards. M3 is very, very good for her, but M1 is a decent stopping point as well if you want to farm another character shard. for the team recommendation, the first recommendation is the electrical team, where she's the main DPS, with Chenxing and Lyfe as the sub DPS, and Acacia and Meow as the supports. So you can kind of choose between Acacia and Meow based on whether you want healing or a time slow ability. And I've given a set of logistics that you would go for if you pick either of them. Then for the second team recommendation, you could go for the time control support team, where Fenny is the support character because her rate of fire support skill is very, very useful. And this team is basically you pick a good DPS character that you have, and then you add Fenny, Coronet, and Redacted in there. The whole idea of the team is to take advantage of Acacia's time slow and Fenny's increased rate of fire to basically increase the DPS window so that your main DPS can be more DPS. And most of the time, this will work with all the good DPS characters, but I recommend a sniper character like Meow Winter Solstice, since you can use the support skill combo to land all of your ultimate shots. Next is Fritia Hush, who I've placed at A tier. He's honestly not a very good DPS for a 5-star character, because the assault rifle is pretty terrible due to ricochet, and her ultimate lowers your mobility a lot, and it still ends when you get CC'd. But she is a great support character for fire DPS characters because her utility is really good. Namely, the stun on her standard skill and the iron body from the support skill will be very useful against tough human bosses in difficult endgame stages. Unfortunately, you have to swap to her to use the stun, so it ruins the buffs that your DPS need to be on field, like Amano Ivato's set effect. The first build he has is the fire support build, which is what I would recommend her as. She's actually a very good support for an iron body that I mentioned earlier. And the weapon that you would primarily use for support is Strawberry Shortcake, which is an incredible support weapon. All of the weapons, the 4-star weapons that give portion of the attack of a support character to the main DPS characters, are really top tier. They're super top tier right now. Some of them are better than 5-star weapons. So keep that in mind. If you're going to raise weapons for supports, then those are the weapons that you generally want to go for. Then the recommended logistics set for this build is Twilight, to reduce the character's resistance, and you have the substats Skill Haste and Energy Recovery, so you can spam the support skill or her standard skill, whichever is necessary, and thermal damage for her first challenge. And you must, whenever you're building a support build of any kind, you're going to go for support neuronic. Then you have the second build, the ultimate laser DPS build, where you just spam the laser as much as possible and try to do as much DPS from the laser as much as you can. It's not really a practical DPS build, but it could become viable if they buff her more. And the weapons you would go for is the 5-star lava bones, mainly, and the logistics set would be Fenny, because, well, the ultimate skill damage buffing logistics set, so that's the best one for this. And of course, you would get the U energy recovery instead of S energy recovery, so that you get the ultimate as much as possible. And for neuronics, you prioritize the ultimate neuronic first as well. In terms of manifestations, if you're going for the ultimate laser DPS build, I think she really needs manifestation, because without her M2, it would be hard to justify even using her ultimate in difficult stages, but M4 is where she really hits a point where she does a lot of damage, and that kind of risk of using her ultimate actually starts paying off at M4. So it's a very good stopping point for farming that if you're going for that build. So for team recommendations, the first team I recommend is the Fire Damage Laser Ultimate Main DPS team, where it's all about basically spamming her ultimate and maximizing thermal damage. So you have Fritia Hush, Fritia Little Sunshine, and Acacia Redacted. Little Sunshine's Davis alignment is very good for buffing damage against burning targets, and Acacia's support skill can be useful for slowing time to create a safe DPS window to use your ultimate. In this team, Little Sunshine should run Twilight and Strawberry Shortcake, while Acacia should run Shinye and Prismatic Igniter. Acacia also has a Davis alignment that gives you more U energy recovery, so that is also another reason why she's good at it. The second team is the Fire team, with Yao Winter Solstice as the main DPS and Fritia Hush and Little Sunshine as the sub-DPS supports. Little Sunshine's Davis alignment and Hush's Iron Body support skills help increase her DPS and survivability. The synergy of this team is really good for thermal damage, and for this team both Fritia should run Strawberry Shortcake and Twilight, but you can also run Shinye on Hush if you're using her ultimate for DPS or just as a U energy battery for Yao. Next we have Lyfe Wildhunt, who I've placed at S tier. He's an SMG character, so she's pretty down there because it's the worst weapon type for the endgame, but her skills do make up for that disadvantage with enough investment. She actually becomes an incredible DPS at M1 and even better at M4. And moreover, her crowd control makes her really good for bosses that are titans in endgame stages. And since titans are not armored, it makes it easy for characters like Lyfe Wildhunt to actually just shoot their weak spots and kill them. And a small note that I've added is that she can use Navigator, but the issue with this logistic set is that it is terrible when enemies are immune to Frozen, and so it's not going to be applicable for every fight. So since most of her damage comes from her skills, the first build that we have is the Frost Damage AoE skill DPS build, which is really good for mobbing. And the weapons that you would want for that is Stardust Memory, then Ionized Jellyfish, then Safety Line, max modified. And the recommended logistics is Thebes, again, to attack as many as you can for the plus 40% attack buff. And it will keep getting refreshed because you're going to keep using her standard skill over and over again. And the substats is Skill Haste and Energy Recovery bonus. Or you can go attack 10%, it depends on kind of what your playstyle is. Do you want to just keep spamming standard skill, then you go for S energy recovery bonus, but if you want more damage, you can go for attack. And third is of course Frost damage. And then you go for her standard skill Neuronics and then ultimate Neuronics for this build. The second build is Frost support, and this pretty much is all about her freezing and reducing frost resistance. The weapons for this is Stardust Memory, but I've also included Frigate Bird, but this could only be used in niche situations, since you want to still use Stardust Memory in case you want to swap to her, but Frigate Bird is very nice if you want to give that attack buff to your main DPS. The recommended logistic is Twilight to reduce the resistance of the target. Substats are Skill Haste and Attack, so this is basically so that you get more attack if you use Frigate Bird. And of course you would go for the support skill Neuronics first on this build. Then let's talk about manifestations. As I mentioned earlier, manifestation 1 is the highest priority. You basically want that as soon as possible. If you have Lyfe Wildhunt, you need to prioritize her. Her M1 is what makes her useful. Without M1, she's very, very bad. And with M1 and with M4, she can be SS tier because of how much damage she does. So keep that in mind. For team recommendations, the first team we have is the Frost team, where she's the Frost damage main DPS. And so kind of similar idea as the one I've described before, You have a Frost main DPS, sub DPS healer. You build Twilight on the sub DPS, Moira on the healer, and you have Acacia or Mauxir as the sub DPS. One more thing that I've added is that Kaguya is an incredible support for Frost DPS because her support skill reduces resistance, and with Twilight it's even better. Plus, if you have Fine Aurora, then she buffs the damage taken by the target as well. The second team is Lyfe as a free support. So in this team, Mauxir will be the main DPS while the other two are sub DPS. So Kaguya and Lyfe Wildhunt are really good as sub DPS as well for specific stages, but this is a very late game team because Mauxir needs a high investment and so does Lyfe Wildhunt for this team to work. But the idea is that Lyfe's free support skills will really help Mauxir deal more damage, and this team will be very good against Titans since you can keep spamming freeze and Titans are vulnerable to freeze. The next character we have is Marian Swift, who is honestly in my opinion the most fun character in the game. Her highly mobile playstyle is super fun, and that's exactly kind of what I like to play in games like these. So she's SS tier because she excels at destroying shields and is very good against bosses like Beauvoir who regen their shields. And with M1, you don't even have to aim for a while after the first ADS shot on a weak spot because it just auto tracks and hits wherever you hit the ADS shot. Her ultimate is also incredible for AoE clear, and the interrupt and cleanse on her support skill actually makes her a great support for certain enemies too. So she's going to be useful as mostly a shield breaker for most people. She might not be the best main DPS because I feel like the upcoming limited characters will overshadow her, but to break shields is going to be amazing. The first build we have for her is the standard ballistic kinetic DPS. So in this, your rotation is to ADS on a weak spot, then use your standard skill and then hip fire shot, right? And that is your standard rotation without M1. With M1, you don't have to ADS on the weak spot again. You can just keep spamming standard skill and hip fire till that feathered mark goes away. Then the weapons recommended for this build is Horn of the Orca, and if you don't have it, you can go for Sweet Soul, and then the Wrench. And the logistic recommended for this build is Therma, because your hip fire shot after using your standard skill gets buffed, so this is perfect for her kit. And the substats you would want is Skill Haste and S Energy Recovery bonus, so you can keep spamming that standard skill. And the neuronics you would go for are the standard skill neuronics and then the ultimate skill neuronics. The second build is the ADS kinetic DPS build if you want to play her like a classic sniper character, hitting weak spots. And so for this as well, Horn of the Orca is very good, but you can also go Crystal Drill if you have it, just like a pretty huge buff for ADS ballistic damage. And then Wrench, the logistics for this is of course Amano Ivato, because you're doing ADS damage, and then you would go for crit damage amplifier and attack. Since you're going to be critting all the time, this will amplify those crit hits. And you have the same neuronics for this build as well. For the manifestations, if you're going for the standard skill Therma build, then you should rush M1 as that's when her kit starts to feel more smooth and satisfying to play. But if you want to farm other characters and still want to increase her manifestations, M3 is a pretty good stopping point. But all of her manifestations are really good, to be honest. For team recommendations, the first team I would recommend is the Kinetic team, with Marian Swift as the main DPS. And the Kinetic team is Marian Swift, Fenny, and Acacia Kaguya. Why is Acacia Kaguya in the Kinetic team, right? Because she decreases all type resistance with her support skill, and she can also help second mobs to use your ultimate for AoE clear. And Fenny is also a great sub DPS who replenishes bullets and can further reduce kinetic resistance with Twilight. So this is useful for both of the builds with Marian, so you can use either of them in this team. Second team is the classic Trinity DPS, Fenny Coronet, Acacia Redacted, and Marian Swift. This basically covers all ranges as I described earlier, but you can also maximize the DPS window for Marian Swift using the support skills of Coronet and Redacted, which is slowing the enemy's time and then also getting a rate of fire increase from Coronet's support skill. Next we have Yao Winter Solstice, who is the highest DPS character at low investment. And she's SSS tier all the way at the top, because with M1 and Space Cowboy, her DPS is unmatchable during her ultimate. And her playstyle is very much a classic sniper style playstyle, so if you find that boring, you might not like it as much, but she does have pretty cool animation. Her support skill is also a very good battery for skill-based main DPS characters, but most of the time you're going to use her as the main DPS of your team in the current state of the game. So if you haven't selected anything from your free selector, and you haven't gone through your beginner banner pools as well, if you didn't get her from the beginner banner pools or the free standard pools, then definitely recommend picking up from the free selector. Don't have her. She's good for pretty much all the bosses because of being a very strong sniper DPS. The first build we have for Yao Winter Solstice is the ADS Thermal DPS build. This is all about using Armando Ivato's buff again. You use her like a classic sniper character for thermal DPS, and you use your ADS to hit weak points. Of course, Space Cowboy is going to be the best weapon for her for almost all of the builds. You can use Sight of Racket if you don't have it in the meantime. And of course, I would recommend getting Space Cowboy from the free weapon tickets that we're getting if you have pulled for Yao Winter Solstice, or if you've got Yao Winter Solstice from the free selector. The substats for this build are crit damage amplifier and attack. If you're hitting weak points, you want to maximize that. Then you will go for standard skill and ultimate skill Neuronics for this build. Second build is fire support. You want to buff your main thermal DPS by reducing resistance. So you would go for Space Cowboy for this again, but you can also go for Deep Sea's Call. Don't have that. And in some cases, Deep Sea's Call might be better because it gives a pretty big attack buff. And those cases are when your Deep Sea's Call is max modified. So the logistics are Twilight, substats are Skill Haste to have low cooldown on your support skill, and attack, because you still do plenty of damage with your support skill, so the attack would buff your support skill when you go for support skill Neuronics. The last one is your ultimate spam build, where you just keep spamming ultimate and reloading using your standard skill, which is really more of a fun build rather than a meta build, but it can work in some niche situations. So you would go for Space Cowboy, and if you don't have it, you would go for Infernal Decade. Then the recommended logistic is Fenny, because it buffs your ultimate damage skill, and your substats would be Skill Haste and energy recovery, so you can keep spamming the ultimate with thermal damage as the third talent. And for this build, of course, you want to have the ultimate Neuronics unlocked first. In terms of manifestations, I highly recommend prioritizing her M1, because she'll be doing incredible damage at M1 even without Space Cowboy, since it allows you to reload your sniper in your ultimate, and once you have Space Cowboy, your damage will skyrocket. M2 is also a good stopping point if you want to prioritize other characters but still want to have Yao deal a lot of damage as a main DPS. Then for team recommendations, the first team is the Fire team, with Yao as the main DPS for thermal damage. And the idea behind this team is to have Little Sunshine's Davos alignment, which buffs the damage done to targets that are burning. And that's why you have Fritia Hush and Enya as your sub DPS as well in the team. And so you would give Strawberry Shortcakes to both the Fritias and Prismatic Igniter to Enya if you pick her. And basically what this will do is it will buff Yao's damage and make her tanky. So the idea is to have the enemy always be burning and reduce their resistance to thermal damage with Twilight on your support characters. Enya is also a really good pick here because she can buff Xiao's shot by 24%. And as I said, with Prismatic Igniter, she becomes a very good support for Yao. The second build is the ultimate spam build. Basically, you want to keep spamming ultimates in this. So you have Winter Solstice, Hush, and Acacia, which are like all ultimate surrounded characters. You can do DPS through their ultimates. And so this team is mostly focused on spamming ultimates to crowd control or DPS in various scenarios, right? And both Fritia and Acacia can use Xinye to increase how fast you gain U energy, since both of them will be faster at gaining U energy than Yao. And Acacia can use Prismatic Igniter to give you a buff, and Fritia can use Strawberry Shortcake. Another thing to note is that with M1 and Space Cowboy, Yao does so much damage as a main DPS that she can fit in most teams. You don't have to optimize a team just for her. Okay, now we move on to the 4-star characters. First one we're going for is Acacia Redacted, who is tier SS, because she's a top tier support character, since her ability to slow time applies to all enemies, and she also gives you energy to the team with her Deus alignment. So she's very great as a support. And she's also great in early game for AoE clear with her standard skill, and with enough investment, she can be very good for AoE clear in late game too. Alright, so let's look at her first build. Her first build is the Chaos Knives AoE DPS build, where you basically spam her standard skill to kill mobs. For this, the best weapon is Nexus, the 4-star weapon, because it buffs her standard skill damage like crazy. And you would use TBs for her logistics set, and Skill Haste and S Energy for her substats to spam your standard skill. Of course, you would go for standard skill neuronics and ultimate skill neuronics, since you're using her as an active DPS with this build as well. The second build is Resistant Shred support. So this is for reducing the chaos resistance of the targets and also slowing them down. The best weapon for this build is Prismatic Igniter, and the logistic is Twilight, with Skill Haste and U Energy Recovery as the preferred substats, because you want to regen your ultimate as soon as possible to use it to slow time for enemies. Then you go for her support skill Neuronics. The next build is the Time Slow support build, which is basically for main DPSs of other elements, and the idea is just to have Navigator Logistic Squad instead. So when you apply that Time Slow control effect, the target receives plus 14% more damage for 10 seconds, but you also have S energy recovery bonus instead of U energy recovery bonus, so you can spam that support skill, and basically the rest of it is just the same. The next build we have is the Ultimate Battery and CC support build, where you're going to increase the U regen of the squad and also spam ultimates and support skill for time slow CC. So you have the same weapons for this for support build, but you use the Xinye Logistic Squad, which allows you to recover your U energy faster and also refunds 20% U energy when you use your ultimate skill. So this is super good for her ultimate, which slows time, and you can use this before using someone else's ultimate with proper timing. And the substats would be U energy recovery instead over here to regen your ultimate, and you would go for the ultimate neuronics first. For manifestations, you can stop at M2 if you're farming her shots. Then for team recommendations, the first one is the Chaos Damage team, with her as the main AoE DPS. This team is pretty simple. Redacted is the main AoE DPS, Cherno is the auxiliary unit support, and Marian is the sub DPS sniper. The next team is the Ultimate Spam team, where you have Redacted, Solstice, and Hush, the one we discussed earlier for Winter Solstice. Basically, you just spam ultimates. Then the next team we have is a Time Control support team, which is an idea basically where you have any good DPS as your main DPS, and you have Fenny, Coronet, and Redacted as the supports. And the whole idea of this team is to take advantage of Acacia's time slow and Fenny's increased rate of fire to increase the DPS window of your main DPS, as we talked about for Marian Swift, right? This works for most characters, but I recommend a sniper character like Yao with the Solstice, since you can use the support skill combo to ensure you land all of your ultimate shots. Then we have Chenxing the Observer, who is a SS tier unit as well, and she's a very useful auxiliary unit DPS character who also does very good AoE electrical damage and is a decent healer. And there is an issue right now where she can't use Moira, so she's kind of a worse healer than Quiet Quitter, Yao, but she makes up for it by increasing your skill damage with her support skill. You do need to invest in her manifestations for the Slayer aura, but her Thunder Soldiers can also act as decoys to tanks for you. Very nice. She's good for both as a sub DPS and a support. And at M3, as I mentioned earlier, you buff the skill damage of operators by 30% with her Slayer aura around the drop pods. She is a great character to invest in. Alright, so the first build for her is the auxiliary unit electrical DPS build. You just spam your Thunder Soldiers with your standard skill and then let them take care of all the enemies and also be the decoys for boss fights. So the optimal weapons for her are Trials Eve for this build, and if you don't have it, you can go for Odd Alley Cat, and then you will go for Usha, the logistics set from the Underground Purge shop, that basically if you keep shooting your weapon on enemies, you'll be buffing the damage of the auxiliary units. So keep that in mind when you're using this build. You have to keep shooting the enemies and landing them, buff your auxiliary units damage. And then you would go for attack and new energy recovery for your substats, and standard skill neuronics first. The next is the healer build. So you would just maximize healing from your support skill. You can go for Trials Eve, but you can also go for Strawberry Shortcake. So think about which choice will be the best based on what you have. But for logistics, you can't use Moira. As I said, she's bugged right now. So you would use 4-star set Green Spirit, which increases the healing effect received by the squad by 28%. So that's good enough for now. And then you can just feed that logistics set to Moira when that bugs get fixed. Her preferred substat is max HP, but for the second substat, you can either go for S energy recovery bonus. If you're under M4, you can keep spamming the support skill, but with M4, he only needs a little bit of S energy, so you can go for attack instead if your Chenxing is at M4. And the third talent is auxiliary unit strength, 10.6%, because heal bonus doesn't work on her as well. You just keep the same thing for all of her builds. Then you go for the support skill, neuronics. The next build is the skill damage support. So you need M3 for this because this will allow you to have a Slayer aura with the drop pod, which increases the skill damage of operators by 30%, but you can also run this at M1. And you'll be using Xinye as your logistics set to basically get your U energy fast and also increase the U energy recovery of the squad. And you basically have the same max preferred substats as the previous one, and the same neuronics as well for this build. Now let's move on to manifestations. I would say that M3 is a decent stopping point, but M4 will drastically reduce the S energy required for support skill. So you can go for that if you want to focus on building attack on logistics instead. So team recommendations. First team I would recommend for Chenxing is the auxiliary units DPS squad. So you just have all of the auxiliary units characters in this, the Observer, Chenxing, Cherno, those two, and Lyfe Wednesday. And this is all about having every auxiliary unit on the board. Just have all of them active. So your typical rotation would be to farm U energy with Chenxing, then use Cherno's ultimate to give all the auxiliary units the damage buff from Cherno's attack to get 25% of her attack, and then you summon Thunder Soldiers with Chenxing to swap to Lyfe to use her Ravens. And all of them can use Usha in this build, but you can also use Xinye on Cherno, and Chenxing can use Twilight to reduce resistance of the enemies. So since Lyfe will be your main DPS, that reduced electrical resistance will actually help do more damage. And preferably, Cherno should be M1 for this team so that Billowberg stays on field for as long as possible. Second team is the Electric team. Fenny, Coronet, Lyfe, Chenxing, the Observer. You have a Fenny as the main DPS, and she gets a nice damage increase if Lyfe has Twilight. And Chenxing can be a healer and support with her Thunder Soldiers as well. So this team is very good for short to medium range fights against mech bosses like Nita mech. The last team is the Ultimate Spam team with Hush, Observer, and Redacted. Hush is the main DPS using her ultimate with Fenya, while the other two buff the damage of the ultimate and increase your energy recovery with Xinye. So Chenxing would use the skill damage support build in this team. Next character is Cherno Those 2, who is C tier because she is highly reliant on her ultimate summon, Billowberg, to do damage since SMG suffers due to ricochet, but she is good as a support who buffs auxiliary units of other operatives in the team. So the first build for her is the auxiliary unit Chaos DPS, so you basically use your Billowberg summon to do all the damage, and Arctic Fox is the best weapon for her for both of her builds, with Tension Headache as the alternative with max modification. So for the first build you would go for Usha as a logistic set, and substats are max HP and U energy recovery. You want max HP so that you can keep Billowberg on field for as long as possible and attack as much as possible. And of course you would go for the ultimate Neuronics for both of the builds since it's all about Billowberg. Second build is the support version of a build where you buff other auxiliary units with Billowberg, and the differences are that you're going to use Xinye logistic set instead to basically spam Billowberg as much as you can, and you have attack instead so you can increase the buff that you're giving to the other auxiliary units, which scales based on Cherno's attack. For manifestations, M1 is a must if you're using Cherno. Without M1 I think she's quite useless. And M3 is a decent stopping point, but most of our manifestations are pretty good. Then for team recommendations, the first team is the Auxiliary Units DPS squad. We already discussed this one earlier, so I'm going to go over to the next one. The second team is the Chaos team, where Cherno is the main DPS. So you have Cherno Those 2, Chenxing the Observer, or Yao Quiet Quitter, and Acacia Redacted. The whole idea of this team is to really keep Billowberg alive as long as possible by healing Cherno and maximizing the damage he does by maxing out Cherno's max HP for wreckage damage. And Acacia can also use Twilight to reduce chaos resistance, and you can choose either healer based on what you need for the stage you are clearing. So between Chenxing and Yao, it completely depends on who you need for which stage. So if you need a long range sniper, you would go for Yao. Next is Enya Big Sis, who is rated at B tier, and that's because her kit is slightly difficult to optimize for DPS, but she is a great support, especially for thermal damage teams. But she's mainly going to be useful for Yao Winter Solstice since her support skill buffs the damage of the shots that Yao does, and with enough manifestations she could be even more useful due to the ballistic damage increase with the snake feathers. So her first build is all about buffing your thermal sniper characters, so it's about spamming your support skill as much as possible to buff your main DPS's shots. And the preferred weapon for both of her builds is Prismatic Igniter, since she's going to be used as support mainly. And you would go for a Twilight logistic set for this, and the classic skill haste and energy recovery to spam your support skill, and support Neuronics for both builds. The second build is basically more of the same, but you're relying more on your ultimate's buff to ballistic damage of other operatives with snake feathers. You take Xinye logistic set instead, and you have attack as your preferred substat, so you can give a bigger buff from the Prismatic Igniter. For manifestations, they're not really necessary. You just want to buff Yao with your support skill, but they're good if you intend to use her ultimate to buff other operators using her second build. So M3 is a decent stopping point for her, but M5 is really where her ballistic damage buff will shine. So that's something to consider, but I don't think it's worth investing so much in her manifestations. There's just so many better characters right now to farm manifestations off. For team recommendations, we already talked about this team in Meow Winter Solstice, but you basically use her as a support for Meow Winter Solstice being the main DPS to buff her shots. Next we have Fenny Lionheart, who is S tier, and she is a great shotgun character with a very good mobility standard skill that also gives her a shield, and she does very respectable DPS, so highly worth investing in. And her support skill also replenishes bullets, so that's very good for certain operatives like Marian Swift, right? So her first build is the ADS Kinetic DPS build, Amano Iwato as usual. The best weapons for this build are Tiny Grains, Alternative Full Alert, and then Knock Knock. And substats are crit damage, amplifier, and attack, and you go for standard skill and then ultimate skill Neuronic first. And the second build is the Shield DPS build, which is all about getting that buff from Kaufman. It's not a very good DPS build to be honest, but we'll have to test it out more. But the idea is to spam your standard skill to get shields and then use that increased ballistic damage from Kaufman to do more damage. And the best weapon for this is Precious Baby. Then the substats are Skill Haste and S Energy Recovery to spam your standard skill. And the third one is not kinetic damage, it's shield construction efficiency. You get more shields when you actually spam your standard skill. And the Neuronics are the same. In terms of manifestations, her manifestations are not necessary, but M1 is great for mobbing since it resets her skill. And for team recommendations, the first team I would recommend is the Kinetic team, where she would be the sub DPS. You have Marian Swift, Fenny Lionheart, and Acacia Kaguya. We already talked about this build as well for Marian Swift, so I'll go over the second build now, which is a little bit more interesting. The second build is more of an idea rather than a viable build, and the idea of this team is to take advantage of the shields that Fenny gets from her M1, along with the shield from Nita's support skill, to do increased ballistic damage with healing support from Meow. This team is probably very good against aggressive melee bosses like Cerberus with shields. The next character is Fritia Little Sunshine, who's also S tier, and she's S tier because she's a very good support for fire teams, since she can apply burning consistently and her Deus alignment buffs the entire squad's damage to burning targets. Her standard skill is also great for AoE clear and skill interrupts, so she plays her role as an AoE mobbing DPS really well. Her ultimate is also the sickest ultimate in the game visually, but it's also great for mobbing. The first build for her is the fire support build, which is good for fire teams. You go for Strawberry Shortcake as your weapon, and then Twilight as your logistics, attack and S Energy Recovery as your substats, and your support skill, Neuronics, and then 1 and 6 as your next Neuronics instead to apply burning consistently. The next build is the AoE standard skill DPS build, where you just spam her standard skill to clear mobs with high damage and also apply burning for increased damage. You would want Lava Bones, the 5-star weapon for this, then Thebes for the logistics set, and then Skill Haste and S Energy Recovery to spam the standard skill. Then for Neuronics, you would go for the standard skill Neuronics first and then the ultimate skill Neuronics. In terms of manifestations, they're not really necessary if you're only using her as a support, but M3 is useful for aptitude-based teams. And for team recommendations, the first team recommended is the classic fire team that we discussed in Meow Winter Solstice, where she is the fire damage support. The second team is where Mauxir is the main DPS and the aptitude sub DPS is Little Sunshine, while you also have Coronet or Chenxing, the Observer, as your support. So this is a pretty interesting team combination because the idea is to use Fritia's aptitude effect with Mauxir's SMG on the extracted souls with the increased rate of fire from Fenny's support skill. But you can also use Chenxing instead of Fenny if she's M1 or above to take advantage of Slayer Aura. This is a pretty late game build, so keep that in mind. Next character is Haru the Ace, placed at D tier. She is the worst character in the game right now in my opinion, because she's designed to be an off-field sub-DPS or support, considering her Deus alignment, but her support skill is actually terrible for most bosses. And her kit is just strangely designed around having her M1 to use her ultimate for buffing other units, but the ultimate costs 80 U energy at M0, which is just not worth it. She's decent for mobbing and AoE sub DPS, but otherwise pretty useless. So for builds, the only build I could come up with is the AoE sub DPS U energy battery build, where you use your ultimate to buff other operative shots, and the weapon you would use is Star Ocean or Bodyguard, and then Hammerhead. Logistic is Chenxing to spam your ultimate, and same for your preferred substats, you would go for skill haste and U energy recovery. And then for neuronics, you go for the ultimate skill neuronics, and then the support skill neuronics. In terms of manifestations, M1 is a must if you're using her, but M3 is also a good stopping point, though I don't really recommend farming her shards unless you really like her. For team recommendations, she could be a kinetic damage support, so we have Lyfe Wildhunt, Haru the Ace, and Marian Swift as the team. Marian is the main solo DPS of the team, and Lyfe is the main AoE DPS. The idea is to use Haru's ultimate for Swords of Oath, switch to Lyfe to clear mobs quickly with SMGs, and then clear the tanky enemies with Marian. Haru will also act as a U energy battery for Marian and Lyfe if you need to use their ultimates. The next character we have is Lyfe Wednesday at A tier. She is pretty much only good for mobbing as an active operator, but she's actually a great support because the support skill applies paralysis, so that makes her very good against mech bosses as an electrical support, but otherwise she's quite limited in DPS because of SMG having issues due to ricochet, and her ravens just don't have enough damage scaling either. The first build for her is the electrical damage auxiliary unit DPS build, where you just spam ravens and keep refreshing the duration with support skills. And the best weapon for this is Arctic Fox, then Work in Progress, then Napoleon in Black. Logistic set is Usha to buff the auxiliary unit's damage. Again, keep in mind that you need to keep shooting with your SMG to keep this buff up. And the substats are attack and S energy recovery bonus, with auxiliary unit strength as the third talent. And for the clusters, you go for the second cluster first for the standard skills, and then you do the ultimate skill neuronics. Then the next build is her as an electrical support to buff your main electrical DPS by reducing the resistance of the target. For this, you can go for Arctic Fox again or Frigate Bird as your support weapon. Then for logistics, you have Twilight. For substats, you have skill haste and attack. And for your neuronics, you would go for the support neuronics first, then your standard skill neuronics. In terms of manifestations, none of them are really necessary, but you get a lot of them for free by completing main story missions anyways. For team recommendations, the first team we have is the Auxiliary Units DPS squad, which we already discussed before. And the second team is the Electric team, which is also something we discussed before, so I'm just going to skip over this as well and move on to the next character. The next character is Marian, Queen of Pain, who is at S tier, and she is a very useful sniper DPS character, especially in the early game, but she's overshadowed by the 5-star snipers that exist in the game right now. Her standard skill is extremely underrated because it's a great decoy, and with neuronic unlocks and M1, it also deals a lot of damage. Her support skill is also very good for busting down bosses like Beauvoir once their shields are down, while her ultimate helps bring shields down and also does great damage to enemies. The first build for her is the ADS Chaos DPS, basically using Amano Ivato again for her sniper character build, and the weapons preferred here are Mark of Mesmer, then Crystal Drill, then Steel Birch Forest, and substats are crit damage, amplifier, and attack, and the neuronics are the first standard skill neuronic, then the 6th and 5th, because you're giving the ballistic damage buff to her ultimate, and then the second cluster. So keep that in mind that it's slightly different from other builds, okay? Then the second build we have is the Chaos Support build, where you've just buffed the main Chaos DPS by reducing resistance of the target. Preferred weapons are Deep Sea Skull, then Disco Confusion, and Steel Birch Forest. Logistic is Twilight, and preferred substats are Skill Haste and S energy recovery bonus. And then you go for the support skill neuronics and ultimate skill neuronics for this build. The next third build is the Chaos DPS ultimate spam, where you just spam your ultimate for chaos damage, and the weapons are same as the first build, but your logistics set is Fenny to buff the damage of your ultimate skill, and your substats are skill haste and U energy recovery, with your neuronics being your ultimate skill and then your standard skill. For manifestations, M1 is good enough for her, so you can stop farming shards at that point. And for team recommendations, the first team is the ballistic team, with Marian as the ballistic DPS. So the idea is to have Marian Swift, Queen of Pain, and Redacted. You destroy the shield of a boss or enemies with Swift, then use Queen of Pain's support skill as many times as possible. Redacted would also help slow time, so you can regen S energy and also help with U energy regen with her Deva's alignment. So this will help you use Queen of Pain's ultimate skill as many times as possible as well while the enemy is shielded. The second team is the Chaos team, with her as the main DPS. So you have Queen of Pain, Cherno, and Chenxing the Observer. Queen of Pain is the main DPS, Cherno is the set DPS, and Chenxing will provide both AoE clear and healing. Then you put Enya on Cherno and Chenxing, so you can spam Queen of Pain's ultimate. The next character we have is Mauxir Meow, who's S tier, and she's my favorite character in the game, but she has a pretty complicated kit, so most people don't really know how good she is, but she's an incredibly useful character in the late game. She could be SS tier, but she does require high investment in neuronics and logistics to be good. And because of how her avatar skills work, she ignores the typical ricochet issue that other SMG operatives face, which makes her the best SMG character for boss fights. She can also attack safely from anywhere with her standard skill and straight up execute enemies if they're under a certain HP threshold. Her support skill is also excellent with neuronics unlocked, as it does good damage to mobs when used with operatives with active AoE DPS skills that have crowd control effects like Acacia Kaguya. I've also included a small note here on the Mizuho logistics squad, because a lot of people have been thinking of using that on her, but you lose the buff from the Mizuho logistics squad after reloading, so Amano Iwato is still way better than Mizuho. Alright, let's get into the builds now. The first build is the Execution Ultimate Skill Frost DPS build, where you use your ultimate skill or your standard skill at M2 to execute enemies. The preferred weapon is Hypochlorous Acid to get more max HP. Your logistic is Shinye. Your substats are Skill Haste and Max HP. And you prioritize the 5th and 2nd neuronic first. Then the second build is the Skill Damage Support build to buff the main DPS like Lyfe Wildhunt by reducing resistance, but also by spawning avatars to do more damage to enemies. Preferred weapon here is Frigate Bird, with Twilight as the logistic set, and substats are Skill Haste and Attack, and you go for the Support Neuronics, then Ultimate Neuronic for this build. The third build is the Ballistic ADS DPS build. The idea is to use Amano Iwato's buff by attacking the weak spot with ADS when you enter her in, and you basically get the max buff, and then you just spawn avatars with your standard skill and attack with ADS with that max Amano Iwato buff. So the preferred weapons for this is the 100 Battle Veteran or Stardust Memory, then the Ionized Jellyfish, and then the Safety Line with max modification. Of course, logistics is going to be Amano Iwato. Substat is Skill Haste and Attack. Then you prioritize her standard skill Neuronics and then ultimate skill Neuronics for this build. For manifestations, I recommend having M2 for the execution build and M3 for the ballistic damage build. But if you're using her as a support, she's fine without any manifestation. For team recommendations, the first team I would recommend is the Frost team, with her as the main DPS. This team is a super late game team since it needs high investment, so she is going to be the main DPS with Kaguya and Lyfe Wildhunt as the sub DPS. And we discussed this team earlier, but this team will basically be very good against Titans since you can keep spamming freeze. The second is the Aptitude main DPS. We talked about this in Little Sunshine, so I'm going to skip over this one. The third team is where she plays the role of an AoE CC active skill support. So you have either Acacia Kaguya, Fritia Little Sunshine, or Cherno, those two as your AoE DPS. You have Mauxir Meow as your support and Chenxing the Observer as the other support. And the idea of this team is that the standard skill of Kaguya, Little Sunshine, and Cherno are AoE damage skills, so they can hit both the hosts and the avatars spawned by Mauxir's support skill. Kaguya's freeze also auto-spawns avatars if you have Mauxir's 4th Theotropic cluster unlocked. Chenxing's role in this team is to buff the damage of active skills with her Slayer aura, assuming she is M1 or above. This team is really good for Underground Purge. The fourth team is the Execution Squad. You have Mauxir Meow, Acacia Redacted, Quiet Quitter, or the Observer. And the idea of this team is that Acacia helps regen you energy with her Devos and Shinye, while Yao or Chenxing heal you, so you can use the execution feature of your standard skill at M2. This is literally all about spamming execution to quickly clear stages with tanky elite mobs, which is also useful, again, for Underground Purge. The next character is Nita Hands, who is at C tier. She's a tanky shield DPS who scales her shield based on attack, and it only lasts for 5 seconds. She uses a shotgun, so she's useful because of that, but there isn't any content in the game where we need shields with iron body right now. She might become useful when we do need shields for certain bosses or stages, but for now she's just decent for mobbing. Now let's get to her builds. The first build is the ADS Kinetic DPS build with Amano Ivato, same as Fenny Lionheart. Aim downsides to maximize shotgun DPS on weak spots. Best weapons are Tiny Grains, then Full Alert, then Knock Knock. Substats are Crit Damage Amplifier and Attack, and then you go for the standard skill Neuronics, then the ultimate skill Neuronics. Then the next build is the Shield DPS, again same as Lionheart, and weapons are Precious Baby, same as Lionheart. The logistic is Kaufman, which is what this build is all about, and the substats are Attack 10% and then Alignment Index, because this increases her shield construction efficiency from her Devos alignment, and then shield construction efficiencies with her talent as well. And the Theotropic clusters, you go for standard skill Neuronics first and then the ultimate skill. Then her third build is Kinetic Shield Support, which is all about giving shields and movement speed buff to the active operative, and also lowering the kinetic resistance of the target using her support skill. So the best weapon for this is the Precious Baby, and logistic is Twilight. Then the substats are Kill Haste and Attack, to basically spam your support skill. And you still go for shield construction efficiency for your third one, so your shields are actually effective from your support skill. And the Theotropic clusters here is actually prioritizing your support skill Neuronics first, then your ultimate skill Neuronics. For manifestations, M2 is recommended if you're using her as a shield support. Then for team recommendations, we have the Kinetic Damage Main Melee DPS role team. So this team has Nita Hands, Acacia Kaguya, and Marian Swift. The idea is that Kaguya decreases all type resistance with her support skill and sucks in mobs, so you can use your standard skill to get shield and Marian's support skill to do damage to them when they gathered up. Then you can finish them off with your shotgun with the Kaufman buff. The next team is Shield Buddies, the team that we talked about with Fenny Lionheart. Basically, you take advantage of the shields that Fenny gets and also from Nita's support shield to increase ballistic damage. And you use Yao as the healer. So this team is very good against aggressive melee bosses. And the last character we have is Yao Quiet Quitter, who is ranked A tier. She's the best healer in the game right now, and she's also a decent Frost DPS sniper, especially with her ammo resupplying and aptitude standard skill. Her support skill and ultimate skill heals a lot. Well, and we also get Olympus for free from the Supernova missions, so that's another source of healing from her. The only issue with healing is that you can clear most content with the game right now by just dodging skillfully, making healers undesirable for people who want to clear difficult stages within time limits. That's the reason for her low tier placement. If she gave some strong buffs or reduced resistance, then she would be placed higher. The first build for Yao Quiet Quitter is the ADS Ballistic DPS build. Again, it's Amano Ivato, and you're gonna have Olympus as the preferred weapon, then Crystal Drill, and then Snowbound Valkyrie. For substats, you go for Crit Damage Amplifier and Attack, and for Neuronics, you go for Standard skill and then Ultimate skill. The second build is Healer, maximize healing from the support skill. Again, you go for Olympus for the weapons, and then the second alternative is the Deep Sea's Call, then Snowbound Valkyrie. So she can actually use Moira, so she's the only character that can use Moira right now to improve the healing from her auxiliary unit. And then for substat, we have skill haste and attack, and heal bonus for the third challenge, keep that in mind, it actually works on her. And then you go for the support skill Neuronics and ultimate skill Neuronics. For manifestations, M2 is nice to have, but none of her manifestations are necessary. Team recommendations is just Frost Team. He will be the healer for Acacia, Kaguya, Lyfe, Wildhunt, and Mauxir. So you just build Twilight on the sub DPS for reducing frost resistance, and then Moira on Meow to increase healing. But honestly, she can fit into any team if you need a healer. And that's all for the character builds. Next in the guide we have the mechanics explained section, the banner schedule, and then links to the community guides and other resources. Check them all out. There's a lot of data and stuff. It is very, very useful. The link to this guide is in the description. I hope you found this guide useful, and have a nice day.